Okay guys, I'm gonna be very honest with you. I have a huge soft spot for the man I'm about to make a video for, mainly because I fell in love with him when I was a junior in high school when I first saw his hoop mixtape. I'm sure you guys know the one I'm talking about, the one he uploaded in 2011. He became this really hyped up recruit. Everyone fell in love with him because of his athleticism, and eventually he went to Kentucky and did a dance move that really took over my generation for like a year and a half to 2 years. So before we get to the content, just take a moment to smack like on that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Check us out on the Laced Up podcast, man. We're back, and when we hit 40,000 subscribers over there, we're going to be giving away a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X to any subscriber that turns on our notifications on the Laced Up podcast channel. And now that we got all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? There's no one that I feel more sympathy for than John Wall in the basketball sense. I mean, I don't think this man's wallet is hurting at all whatsoever, but I think once you get to a specific point in your career, unless if you're a specific type of player, I feel like you begin to chase something a little bit more meaningful than just money. And I think that's where John Wall is in his career. And as a matter of fact, things were really beginning to look up for this guy up until the 2017 season. I mean, the number one knock I've always had on John Wall as a player was that he wasn't necessarily the best three-point shooter, but in the 2017 to 2018 season, he shot a beautiful 37% from three, but that's when things began to go downhill for him a little bit, because after signing a tremendous maximum contract extension with the Washington Wizards during the 2019 to 2020 season, he would sustain an Achilles tear. And just like that, John Wall went from being one of the best players in the NBA, one of the most exciting point guards to watch in the entire NBA, to a player that is easily, without a doubt, the worst contract in the NBA. And somehow, some way, the Washington Wizards were able to convince the Houston Rockets that, hey, this is a good return for Russell Westbrook. And on December 2nd, 2020, the Houston Rockets traded Russell Westbrook for John Wall and a first-round pick. And as a matter of fact, I think they ended up with a better return than what the Washington Wizards would get, because eventually, as we all know, Russell Westbrook would eventually get traded to the Los Angeles Lakers for Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Montrezl Harrell, Kyle Kuzma, and the draft rights to Isaiah Jackson. So it's not like either of these teams really won, and it's not like either of these players, or at least John Wall, I don't really know about Russell Westbrook, are really the players that they once were. But now we're in a fairly peculiar situation, because even though the Houston Rockets team on paper looks really good, you know, you have John Wall, you have Eric Gordon, you have Jalen Green, you have Christian Wood. Even though their team looks fairly decent on paper, it seems like they are running into this issue where they don't really know if they're going to be rebuilding, or they don't really know if they should, I guess, push for a potential play-in spot. I don't really know. Well, after we saw what we saw from John Wall last year, a post-Achilles tear John Wall isn't necessarily the worst player. You know, I've seen a lot of players come back from Achilles tears not looking nearly as good, and the man was at least serviceable. I mean, he was able to drop 21 points, his field goal percentage dropped to 40%, he had a 32% three-point shooting percentage, so not necessarily the greatest player, not necessarily an all-star caliber talent, but still a decent or serviceable player. If you look at his advanced statistics, his offensive box plus minus was a 1.4, his DBPM was in the negatives, negative 1.6. Overall, he was a net negative 0.2, and his player efficiency rating was a 15.4, which is the lowest it's been throughout his entire career. Now again, there are significantly worse players out there talent-wise than John Wall, and if you even look at his VORP, value over replacement player, it's at a 0.6. So at the very least, it's not a question of whether or not John Wall deserves to be in the NBA, because this guy could still play. He's no longer a franchise cornerstone type of piece. He might be a average starter starter to a high-end role player off of the bench. And I think the Houston Rockets acknowledge that. And I think the news we got from Champ Charania could kind of open your eyes in regards to that. So according to Champ Charania, after taking a pretty decent hiatus, as I guess we kind of did too, because, you know, news has been slow on this channel and we don't really bring you news unless there's something to talk about, John Wall and the Houston Rockets met and they are mutually agreeing to work together on finding a new home for the 5-time All-Star point guard. Now, the plan is for John Wall to be present at training camp, but he's not going to play in any Houston Rockets games this season. So this is eerily reminiscent of what happened with 2 players last year. If you remember LaMarcus Aldridge, at a specific point, the San Antonio Spurs sat him down and said, hey, this isn't working out for us. You know, you're not really contributing to what we're trying to do here. And that's not to say that LaMarcus Aldridge didn't have talent. I guess they just wanted to experiment with different things, like I guess putting DeMar DeRozan at the power forward position. I'm not exactly sure, but eventually what would happen is after the San Antonio Spurs attempted to trade LaMarcus Aldridge, which it didn't work out because no one really wanted LaMarcus Aldridge's contract, they eventually opted to buy him out, and we all know what would happen from there. LaMarcus Aldridge would go to the Brooklyn Nets. He'd eventually sit out for the rest of the season and announce his retirement due to a heart issue, and now the man is literally coming back and playing for the Brooklyn Nets. I guess he got multiple opinions, and some doctor told him, hey, you could play, which I honestly think is a little scary, but that's a different topic for a different day. I wanted to make a dedicated video on this during the time, but I was in Italy and the audio file corrupted, unfortunately. Another player that this is eerily reminiscent of is Andre Drummond and the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cleveland Cavaliers didn't even play him last year. That could have to do with the fact that they had like Kevin Love and Kevin Love didn't really play last year either, but they had multiple centers on the roster and they were just trying to find a trade candidate for Andre Drummond. After scouting and seeing the market for Drummond, they saw no one really wanted him and they eventually elected to buy him out. So in this instance, there are no buyout plans for John Wall according to this Athletic article by Champ Charania, and I really don't blame them. There's 2 years and $91.7 million remaining on his contract, including a $47.4 million player option for the 2022 to 2023 season, which yikes, there's no doubt in my mind that this man's definitely going to opt in and get his $47 million. So at this point, it should be really interesting to see what kind of team would trade for John Wall. And I think my number one candidate to potentially trade for John Wall would be a team like the Los Angeles Clippers, because I think John Wall would be a great complement to Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. He's not necessarily good enough to be the number one de facto option on the offense, but definitely good enough to potentially lead an offense and probably be the number 3 option, set up plays for his teammates. This is a man that typically, at least in his prime, had no problems averaging 10 assists per game. Obviously, more recently on the Houston Rockets, it was 7 assists per game. In his last season with the Washington Wizards, it was 8.7 assists per game. This is something that the Clippers need. They need someone that could create plays for Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, so Kawhi Leonard and Paul George could affect the game with their scoring and of course their remarkable defense. The question does remain in regards to John Wall's defensive abilities, but again, he's only kind of a liability. He's not like a major liability, so I think this is a perfect trade for the Clippers because I don't think they're gonna have to give up that much. Typically, the reason why the Clippers would not be able to acquire a player was because they don't have any draft picks for the future. I don't think the Houston Rockets are seeking draft picks for the future. Maybe some young players, maybe some good role players, and just maybe the opportunity to get out of John Wall's contract in general. So let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think about all this. Do you think John Wall is probably going to go to the Clippers? Do you think there is another team that is more likely to trade for John Wall, or do you think he's potentially going to get bought out because he has no market whatsoever? Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.